Hey guys, so this next lesson is on the actual development of the baby once the baby's inside the mother's uterus and her endometrium. So here's her endometrium. Here's the baby. Okay, the baby has an outer layer that we already called the chorion. Okay. And an inner layer that becomes the baby. So here's the inner layer that becomes the baby. And here's the baby. So you won't know you're pregnant at the beginning because if this is the mother's uterus, the baby's completely buried inside her uterus, so she wouldn't know any changes. Like the biggest change is she wouldn't get her period, right? Because here's her uterus and there's the baby that's inside of it, and the baby is extremely tiny. You can't even see it. You need a microscope to see it. But the baby develops inside and it eventually grows and grows and grows. And eventually you start to see the mother's stomach kind of protrude and get bigger as the baby grows bigger. But we're going to talk about the baby's development in the mother and what happens to the structures. They're called... These structures that are supportive are called the extra-embryonic structures. So the extra-embryonic structures, if I call it an extra-embryonic structure, it just means all the structures that are extra in embryonic development. Okay, so an embryo, we call the baby an embryo, basically from day, after it implants, right? So the implantation takes about day 7 to month 3, I call it an embryo, and then from month 3 onwards, I call it a fetus, okay? Anyways, so there's the baby and the supportive structures that surround the baby. We're going to talk about the supportive structures first. Okay, so I'm going to just kind of draw you a timeline. This is the baby after implantation, so maybe this is week 1. And then during week 2, you have an event called gastrulation occurring. So gastrulation occurring just means that the baby is developing into 3 distinct layers. Okay, so we're going to get what we call morphogenesis occurring. So morphogenesis is a change in shape. Change in shape. Okay, so this is week 2, right? Week 1 was implantation. Week 2 is gastrulation. And this is an event that's extremely important in the baby's development, right? And during gastrulation, there's 3 layers that form. Okay, so you guys imagine, okay, so I'm going to draw this out again. So there's this outer layer, right? And actually, let me just show you. There's going to be an outer layer. Okay, so the outer layer of the baby is called the chorion. Okay, and then we're going to start to see the development of an inner layer. That's going to be the amnion. And then we're going to see the baby itself inside. And the baby's going to start to develop into 3 layers. There's an outer layer called the ectoderm that the baby develops into. There's a middle layer, okay, called the mesoderm that the baby develops into. And then there's an inner layer called the endoderm. Okay, so you can see that we've gone from this group of cells here that become the baby to this event called gastrulation, where we see 3 distinct layers. And each layer has a developmental fate, which means each layer becomes something. So the ectoderm becomes the nervous system and the brain, right? The mesoderm becomes muscles and bones. The endoderm becomes your skin, right? So at this phase in life, at this phase, you can see that we're starting to see cell specialization, where cells start getting their own special function. And that each one of these layers has its own kind of fate. You can look it up. Dr. Taylor's PowerPoint has more detail of what each structure becomes if you're interested in knowing it. This also becomes the reproductive system, all right? And this also becomes the endocrine, endoderm for endocrine, and basically it'll go into that in more detail in her in her notes that she has posted online. Okay, so that's what's happening, right? Where we have this gastrulation. It's extremely important event, week 2, right? So as the baby is developing, the structures are developing. So we have that chorion, which we know releases HCG. But this chorion, okay, so you got to watch what's happening to this chorion. This chorion starts to develop like this. The chorion starts going like this, where you're going to see these branches coming off the chorion. And that is called chorionic villi. Okay, so that's called chorionic villi. It comes from the actual chorion layer, which is the outer layer of the baby. And then inside is the amnion. And the amnion is the inner layer. Chorion is the outer layer. And the amnion, right, inside the amnion is going to be this amniotic fluid. So the amniotic fluid is sort of housed by the amnion. And like, it actually functions as a shock absorbent. So basically, if you have like an impact, like if the mother is carrying the baby and there's like an impact, this amniotic fluid actually is a shock absorbent. So it protects the baby from any kind of impact. Like whether it be a car accident or anything like that. So the amniotic fluid is extremely important. The baby kind of swims around in that amniotic fluid. It is surrounded by that fluid throughout the duration of her pregnancy. And so this amnion keeps the amniotic fluid surrounding that baby. That's the inner membrane, right? And then you have this chorion, which starts to develop this chorionic villi. And you guys, this all is still inside the mom. She's still housing that baby. You probably don't even know you're pregnant at this time. This gastrulation event occurs early on, right? And the baby is so tiny that, again, you'd probably need a microscope to see it at this point still, okay? Anyways, there are other structures that begin to form. So like this, let's just draw it on week 9. Or let's just draw it week 12, okay? So by week 12, you're about 3 months old. And by week 12, you're actually gonna start to see, like, there's a baby. So like this would be the baby. Okay, this would be the baby, like that. And the baby is connected to its mother through a structure called the umbilical cord. Okay, so now this umbilical cord, this is kind of hard to draw. So this umbilical cord, right, this in red that I'm drawing is the chorion, and this that I'm drawing is chorionic villi that's coming out of the chorion. I'm going to draw this red and blue. Okay, so this is the chorionic villi. Coming in this way and coming out that way. So take a look, you guys. What I'm drawing here is all these blood vessels, okay? Red. Right? What I'm drawing is, this is the chorionic villi. Okay? This is the umbilical cord. And you can see that the chorionic villi is actually blood vessels. Okay, it becomes blood vessels. And all of this chorionic villi came from that outer layer that is called the chorion. Right? And that's what is like secreting that HCG. Okay, so this chorion, which is the outer layer, forms this chorionic villi, which is basically the baby's blood vessels. This baby's blood vessel is surrounded by the mom's blood vessel. So imagine this is the mom's endometrium, right? So this is mom's blood. This is baby's blood. The chorionic villi is baby's, and this is mom. And so mom has oxygen that she breathes in, that then the oxygen goes into the chorionic villi. Oxygen goes into the chorionic villi, and it travels to the baby. Okay, remember there's a heart. And so it's traveling through the umbilical cord. Now in return, the baby is making CO2 waste, and it's moving out that way. And there's CO2, there's CO2, there's CO2, right? And that CO2 is now going into the mother's blood, and the mother breathes it out, right? So this chorionic villi is baby, and then this CO2 goes from baby to back to mom, where the mom now takes that CO2 and she breathes it out, right? Any kind of waste that baby makes, whether it be like, I don't know, it could be making urea, that needs to go out. But like anything that mom brings in, that's like nutrients like glucose, that needs to go in, right? So there's this constant exchange. So imagine there's glucose that mom has, or food, or hormones, or vitamins, or anything that mom, has in her blood. That's all given to her. That's all absorbed by the chorionic villi, and then travels through the umbilical cord and feeds the baby. So it can grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Right? And any kind of waste that baby makes, whether it be urine or poo, that's all given back to mom. So she's breathing out the baby's CO2, she's pooing out its poo, she's peeing out its pee, right? It's this exchange that's occurring in this interface here, right? And like eventually this whole interface here, this whole interface is called the placenta. So the placenta is basically the chorionic villi plus the mom's blood mix, and it's disc shaped. So when I mean disc shaped, like, so because I ran out of a little bit, if I'm drawing the baby here and there's the umbilical cord, right, and it's all that chorionic villi that's like coming out, right, and then this is the mother's blood, right? That this entire structure becomes a disc-shaped structure with the chorionic villi of the baby and the mom's blood here, and that makes up the placenta. And basically the placenta is forming like right at week 1 and becomes totally completely developed by month 3. So by month 3, the placenta is developed. Okay? And when the placenta is fully developed by month 3, the placenta actually now releases estrogen and progesterone. And so you don't need the HCG anymore. So like during month 3, this placenta is going to release estrogen and progesterone. So you don't need the chorion to release HCG anymore. You don't need that to happen anymore because the placenta now is developed, and that's why you don't usually tell people that you're having a baby until you are 12 weeks, because by 12 weeks the placenta is basically fully formed, and then you can, and once you have a fully formed placenta, that means the chorionic villi is good. That means the baby can receive nutrients from mom, give out waste back to mom, and that is what's really important. Okay, so now you got the umbilical cord. Don't forget that you have an inner layer, and the inner layer is called the amnion, and inside the amnion is amniotic fluid. Okay, so now, you guys, it's really important for you to see that what is the structures that support the baby? The chorionic villi, the placenta, the umbilical cord, right? The amnion, the chorion, right? And here's the amniotic fluid. Those are all supportive structures. So that means they all originated from this outer layer of the baby. Okay, and then this is the baby itself. And the baby originates from that inner cell mass that we had at the very beginning. Okay, so that is basically what you need to know. Another supportive structure that you need to know is what we call the yolk sac. So here's the yolk sac. And this actually makes red blood cells until the liver is fully functional. So this yolk sac sort of disappears after the second month. So you guys have a yolk sac, and then you use it until the baby has a functioning liver, and the yolk sac kind of disappears. So that again is another structure that supports the baby during its development. Okay, and initially the umbilical cord was called the allantois. So the umbilical was initially called the allantois, and then that became the umbilical cord. And it takes a few weeks for the allantois to become the umbilical cord, and that is the development of the baby. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. You need to know like basically what happens during each trimester. So like when a woman is pregnant, it's trimester 1, trimester 2, and trimester 3 is how they sort of divide her pregnancy. So this is month 1 to 3, this is 3 to 6, this is 6 to 9, and you got to know what's happening because we're doing like under COVID, I'm not going to go through. Trimester 1 is when you have all the organs, but they are not functioning. Like, I mean, the only thing that's really functioning is like the heart starts beating at 4 weeks. Okay, so if you give birth during trimester 1, your baby is not going to survive because none of the organs work. If you take drugs or do alcohol during the first 3 months, that's when it's going to have the most effect on the baby, because that's when the organs are developing in the baby. So really important, right? It can have a detrimental long-term effect on the baby. Trimester 2, the baby grows and the organs start to function. The last organ to develop is the lungs. The lungs become fully functional in the 3rd trimester around the 8th month. Okay, so during trimester 2, the organs start to function. Now, in trimester 2, if you give birth, there is a chance that your baby can survive, especially if it's later in the 2nd trimester, although they're going to need support because of the fact that some of their organs are not fully functional, right? Trimester 3, lungs are developing by the 8th month. And like this is basically trimester 3 is when you get like increased fat development in the baby and things like that. So that is what's happening as the baby develops inside the mom, and it's divided into 3 trimesters. Okay, now my last lesson with you is going to be on labor and delivery, and that shouldn't take long, but I'm done with this lesson.